To return to our top story tonight, the inquiry into newspaper ethics in the wake of the phone hacking scandal. At the heart of the inquiry, as Lord Justice Leveson himself put it today, is who guards the Guardians. I'm joined in the studio by Alan Rusbridger, the editor-in-chief of The Guardian. Though his paper's been at the forefront of exposing the apparent excesses of the press, he opposes government regulation. And by Lord Prescott, the former Deputy Prime Minister, himself a victim of phone hacking and of exposure into his private life. Lord Prescott, are you prepared to join Alan Rusbridger in taking statutory regulation off the table? I'm
certainly not. In fact, statutory frameworks are there because this is all about the balance between private rights and the public interest, and we have a legislation and courts to decide that. I'm not agreeing the independent one, no regulation, that allows the editors to decide what the balance is. They're more concerned with selling papers than the rights and balance between private interest and indeed public interest.
Given that sort of so-called self-regulation has failed so badly, isn't statutory regulation the only option?
Well, I think what's become apparent is that what we called self-regulation wasn't regulation. And Lord Hunt, who's come in to be the new chair of the PCC, the first thing he said was that the PCC wasn't a regulator. So my view is we should try regulation before we scrap it or we go over to state regulation. And
you mean try getting the PCC to regulate?
Well, it means you have to replace the PCC with something that has teeth and has sanctions and brings in people like Richard Desmond who are currently out of it. But I think it's very dangerous to have the state. I mean, we haven't had state regulation in this country since 1695, and I don't think we should go back down that route.
But let's be facing it, Desmond's made it clear, he's come out of the actual PPC, the press complaints procedure. How do you get him to come in if he doesn't want to come in? I know Alan has made a recent lecture, some of it which I agree with on mediation, but he almost says there'll be an incentive for Desmond to come in because it's cheaper to operate a legal case through the PPC and the proposals he has than actually going to the courts. Well, I'm afraid I'm not convinced about that. You'll need a statutory framework that covers all the papers, otherwise it doesn't have any effect.
Isn't the problem, Alan Rusbridger, that once you have an independent regulator of some description, whether it includes editors or not, it has to be set up by statute, and immediately the state is involved in some form?
Well, the more you can remove it from the state...
But would you accept it being set up by the state?
Yeah, yes, the state has to...
So what's the ultimate sanction? I mean, supposing they find this group of people, I'm not quite sure who they are, but they find that there's been an offence committed by a paper and the paper refuses to redress it. What's the last course of action?
Well, then you get thrown out of self-regulation, and that's why you have to think of this regime of carrots and sticks. So I think there's lots of creative thinking at the moment. Maybe that there's a different VAT rate if you're in from if you're out, or you can avoid the hideous cost and processes of libel if you're in but not out.
But Alan, in 1997, this is what gets me about this. In 1997, when we transferred the human rights for our legislation to be under the European Court of Rights, right? When we did that, they required you to have an independent body. What we failed to do as a Labour government, we accepted the industry's argument that self-regulation was the best way of doing it. Lord Wakeham was the man in charge then.
But you talked about newspapers wanting to make money. He's got an excellent solution for losing them money if they misbehave.
Well, that's if everybody cooperates with it. If you don't have a proper framework, Desmond's walked out on it at the moment. You can't assume we'd come back. But can I just finish my point about the actual regulated form? We said in 1997, OK, we'll listen to you. I didn't agree myself. We'll listen to your self-regulation system. We've had nearly 10 years of it. It hasn't worked, has it? We've seen the worst acts of criminal act undermining democracy and any confidence in the British press. So to assume now, this year, let's go back to business as usual with a little bit of incentive on the financial side within the PCC is nonsense.
Well, there's going to be a lot of pressure against statutory regulation, certainly from the media. But assuming that you do get an independent body set up by statute, would editors be on it?
I hope not.
I think you can have editors who advise. I mean, I personally wouldn't have any serving editors on.
Well,
you can have some.
That's crucial.
People who
that's
understand
a statement.
It. Yeah, I would have no serving editors.
Editor-in-chief of The Guardian would not have an editor anywhere near.
I would have the code opened up. What's been interesting about the last few weeks is you've had big movement from the Mail, big movement from the Mirror, the conference today in which people from academia, from the law, from other countries were coming in. I think there is definite signs that the press are moving, and there's an acknowledgement that regulation, as it was in the past, has failed. Nobody is arguing for business as usual.
Can I ask you a blunt question? Are you scared of Leveson?
Not from what I've seen so far. I think he's got good people advising him, and I think I don't see any suggestion that he's starting this from the point of view of wanting self-regulation.
And are you worried about Leveson, given that he doesn't actually have anybody who's ever had anything to do with the tabloid newspaper on his actual
Well,
inquiry?
they've had journalists on there as well.
Yeah, but I don't think either of the two journalists that are there have had anything to do with the tabloid
tabloids
paper.
haven't covered themselves in glory, have they? We pretty well know and seen what they've been doing.
Yeah, but they know
over
what
the
the
last few
pressures
years.
are from inside.
Well, the
Surely it would
pressures
be
are clear. Do you want to do what the editor tells you? Find out information in whatever way, something that sells papers, nothing to do with the balance between individual rights and public interest. So, but anyway, we have the inquiry we've got. I'm satisfied with that. I'll wait to see what comes out of it. I must admit I was a little bit worried when I heard Mr. Leveson, the Lord Leveson, saying on television tonight, he said, well, without Murdoch, we wouldn't have had a free press. Come on. I know he had difficulties. I know what he's allowed to. But The Guardian isn't successful because it was not fighting at Wapping. That's nonsense. But I hope he doesn't get... That's a conventional view of his, I think. Nothing to do with the actual facts.
I want to clarify one last thing, and that is, as here tonight, given that The Guardian took a lead in this exposure, you're not concerned that you might find yourselves curtailed even in that kind of enterprise?
Well, I mean, what is being unveiled today is much worse than anything we feared. So previously we knew about 15 arrests. Now we're hearing that 30 people are involved. It's now nearly 6,000 victims. So I think the story is going to get worse and worse, and it's going to take 2 or 3 years. So I think there's going to be a lot of pain. But from what I've seen of the panel, there's some quite level heads on it.
Alan Rusbridger, John Prescott, sorry to end it there, but thank you very much indeed for coming in.